everyone, and I think we're good to start now. So thanks to everyone for registering and our panelists today. My name's Jonathan Warren. I'm the Chief Executive of Localis, and we've got a policy webinar today, Level Best, Decoding Local Growth Policy. The purpose of this, we brought together a fantastic panel of experts to discuss the future of economic growth under the aegis of the Levelling Up agenda. It could be too, just debating earlier in the green room, it could be too marshmallowy and mum and apple pie. But I think there's a lot to tease out from this, different points of view to contend. And the background to this is a report to which my colleague Joe Fiennes and Zain Qureshi issued back in May, really a localist critique of the plan for growth, the budget document setting out the government's economic policy. And from our perspective at Localis, the central thrust of our argument is maybe there ought to be a strict separation between some of the short-term community-led decision-making for things like town centre renewal and high street investment that boosts place prosperity, and perhaps a separation from long-term, higher value, central government-led infrastructure strategies aimed at reducing historic low levels of productivity. Now, the timing for this is very good. This time last week, the Commons Business, Energy, and while they've still got the title, Industrial Strategy Committee, issued their own report into the government's decision to really move on from the industrial strategy to the plan for growth. And quoting from it, that the report observed, the plan for growth should be developed with regional and local leaders in England, with a focus on promoting local engagement with industrial policy, and not merely a strategy document for consumption in Whitehall. So the purpose of today's debate is really how do we make sure this doesn't become another strategy document, and how to ask, with the Levelling Up white paper imminent, the local state could be best deployed and leveraged to build back. Some of the points for discussion we'll be raising today will be looking at that link between placemaking, regeneration and productivity. Also looking at what kind of interventions might best close the gap between London and the southeast and the rest, and how should central government funding best be deployed to those ends? How do we measure this stuff? What are the metrics? How should we measure success? What sort of timeframes should be involved? And what would actual proof benefits of levelling up look like? We've also got in the autumn, the spending review to look forward to, our first multi-year public finance settlement for a while. What should the role of public service funding be in promoting economic growth? Taking issues like local housing supply or tackling social care demand. So this is kind of what we've got today. How do we use levelling up to make the best use of the local state? And we've got, as I said, a superb panel. First up in alphabetical order, we have Councillor Ben Bradley MP for Mansfield, and now his dual hat as leader of Nottinghamshire County Council. Ben became the first Conservative MP for Mansfield in June 2017, and his own priorities include skills and education. We also have Localis's Head of Research, Joe Fiennes, who authored our analysis of the plan for growth. Great pleasure to have Professor Tony Travers, Director of LSE London, known to all in this debate today. His interests include local and regional government and public service reform, and amongst his many hats, he's an advisor to the Commons, Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee. And finally, great pleasure to have Catherine West, Labour MP for Hornsey and Wood Green, also a member of the all-party parliamentary group for devolution. Catherine has previously been leader of Islington Council. She served as chair of London Council's Transport and Environment Committee. And in 2013, unless I'm mistaken, you were LGIU's Local Authority Leader of the Year, Catherine. So here's the frame to debate about levelling up. How do we best use the local state in this? We're going to run this as a straightforward, simple Zoom webinar debate. I'm going to ask each of our expert panelists to explain to me, to all of us, what's most important for them arising from the levelling up agenda in terms of the current context with the spending review and the levelling up white paper imminent. Once that's all done, we're going to throw it over to a Q&A, so please lob in your questions, if you can, into the Q&A box. We'll be looking at the chat box too. We'll be tweeting that we're live tweeting this, so please, the hashtag for today is hashtag level best if you want to get engaged in Twitter. So we're going to finish at 12 on the dot, if not before. And I'm now going to invite Ben Bradley MP to unmute and make a start. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jonathan. Hello, everybody. Good morning. Really interesting and pertinent time to have this debate, as you touched on there, Jonathan, because of the state of play in terms of government policy making with the spending review, with this levelling up white paper coming in the autumn. I hope you mentioned there, my twin hats, if you like, in terms of being a member of parliament and local authority leader. I'm certainly trying to use those joint hats to have a real say in what this looks like on a government level. And it's been really interesting the last couple of months digging into this, to be able to have these local stakeholder conversations and be able to take that directly to ministers. And my God, I've met with a lot of ministers on this agenda in the last few weeks. So really, really interesting time. I think the key elements of this to me, firstly, I think it's really important that levelling up a white paper looks to put a bit more of a coherent long-term plan around all of this. We've seen lots of very ad hoc kind of pots of funding, towns fund, levelling up fund, that will give us, I hope, lots of shiny things to point to, and will be perhaps a bit of an impetus and a bit of a driver for local economies in the coming months and years. But it's a short-term thing, and it's not, a new building in the town centre is not in itself going to drive a long-term change for left behind areas. So it's about finding that balance. I think COVID has made it much more difficult for us to pick out some of the places as well that most need this help. I'm from Nottinghamshire, and I know some of the many struggles that Nottingham City has had, for example, whereas 2 years ago we might have argued that it is our northern towns in the county, those working class old coalfield towns, that are very much in need of this levelling up agenda. I still believe firmly that that is the case and the priority, by the way. But I know I've no doubt that city-based colleagues will be making the case that they've perhaps been harder hit by coronavirus. So it does muddy the waters somewhat. But I hope that the levelling up white paper will strike this balance, or try to find this balance between, as I say, those short-term shiny capital projects and our long-term agenda, which to me is much more around creating employment. It's much more around skills and how you find constituents in the places like the one I represent in Mansfield, often the wrong end of all of those economic and social tables, sustainable long-term employment and careers that are going to overall boost our local economy for many years. So this levelling up white paper is an opportunity with the spending review to try and start to shape that strategy. I guess for us in the East Midlands, there are a number of things in play. We've done very well in some of those places out of our Towns Fund and levelling up agenda so far. I think 130 million across North Nottinghamshire for 4 or 5 different towns in the area, very much in need of it, and some of the most disadvantaged areas in the region, if not the country, including my own constituency. As I say, the challenge of the long-term agenda here is it's much more complex. How do you create sustainable, lasting employment in places like this? The white paper needs to have a coherent template for that, and I think for us, there are a number of factors to that. We've got actually, and one of the reasons of having all these meetings with ministers is we've got a bit of a package that we want to try and put across as a region. How can we get those, to coin a phrase, oven-ready projects over to government ahead of the white paper, and not just react to it, but try to shape it for our region? We've got all sorts of things underway. We've got our development corporation in the East Midlands, which is a fairly unique prospect in terms of the delivery of planning infrastructure across a number of sites for economic development and jobs growth. We've got our unique inland free port that we've been given the initial go-ahead for this year, and there are lots of conversations about free ports and how useful and how helpful they are, but certainly a driver, an incentive for us to attract business investment to our region, recognising that the East Midlands is consistently the least invested in region of the UK, both on a public and private investment kind of scale. And we've got the ongoing and fairly soon to be decided discussion around the integrated rail plan and HS2 and what that means for our region, and whether we get our hub at Toten that we've been planning for 7 years and the jobs and growth that comes around that, or we get something else which would be less desirable. So all of that as a package, I think, is quite an attractive thing that can create thousands of those sustainable jobs. And with our DevCo, where we can master plan it over the whole of that area, we can perhaps look to create something a bit more than just logistics sheds on the side of the M1, which is typically where a lot of people in our region are employed. And the big thing that I'm trying to feed into this conversation, just to kind of wrap up, I suppose, is how do you manage all of that on a regional basis? Because we're also the only region that doesn't have a combined authority, doesn't have a devolution settlement that passes all this stuff down to local decision makers. I think we miss out as a result of that. And you can certainly see the differential investment between the East Midlands and places like Birmingham and Manchester. So that's a very live conversation too. I understand that the devolution white paper is effectively folded into the levelling up white paper and that agenda. So an awful lot to talk about, as well as the very localised partnerships we're developing around skills and employment that, you know, I'd happily wax lyrical for many hours about, Jonathan, but conscious of time. So I think in summary, you know, the levelling up white paper needs to make a coherent case now as to how this is not just an early kind of capital set of projects for us to build buildings, but actually how it develops into a long-term strategy for each location, not just a national strategy, but for each place around creating the right skills and the right sustainable employment in different regions for us to be able to really give people opportunities to find that better paid work. Ultimately, that's the end game for levelling up for me.
Ben, thank you very much for getting us off to such a flyer there, especially with that, you know, your perspective as a local leader. Next up, Localis' Head of Research, Joe Fyans. Joe, you're going to briefly explain kind of the main findings of our Localist critique of the plan for growth. So over to you, please. Thanks. Take it away.
Yeah, thanks, John. Hopefully this should build on some of what Ben was just saying there as well about the different perspectives on levelling up in terms of long and short term. So the point of our report was to look at what role the local state and its various institutions could or should play in levelling up. And the devolution conversation is not particularly lively at the moment. Devolution for devolution's sake has fallen off the political agenda. And I think this is well captured in the transformation of the white paper that Ben mentioned, from a English devolution white paper to a levelling up white paper. I think that says it all. The government has displayed many centralising tendencies throughout the pandemic, and this has been a cause for despair among some advocates of localism. However, there is an acknowledgement of regional disparity and, crucially, its political cultural dimension in all of this, which is at a high watermark for recent years, that kind of acknowledgement. These are things that are built up over time and we're not going away. A long history of regional inequality, supercharged in more recent decades. Hang on a second, let me change my mic.
Am I easy to hear now? I received a comment saying I was not easy to hear. Is that better?
Keep going, Joe.
Okay, cool. So rather than a moral or intellectual case for devolution, with levelling up, the context, it becomes more about desired outcomes and what the role of local government and other local institutions should be in the realisation of these outcomes. It's a much more functional understanding of the local government ask, which requires understanding the different elements of what it would take to close the gap that levelling up is targeted at. So the first step in doing this is disentangling the means, ends and methods of the levelling up agenda. The prospectus for the Levelling Up Fund says that that fund itself is for high value infrastructure, town centre regeneration and cultural investment. The broader agenda sits within the so-called people's priorities, which are identifying the plan for growth as levelling up the whole of the UK, reaching net zero and becoming a global Britain. And many of the claims about levelling up, they tend to sort of focus on what Ben was talking about, opportunity, the national distribution of opportunity. So there's a lot going on, but I think there are two clear overarching goals identifiable. There's a kind of technocratic, very macroeconomic ambition about boosting innovation, and there's a more short-term focus on raising the living standard in places. So in our plan for local growth, we characterize this split as being one between raising productivity nationally and raising prosperity locally. And these things are all connected, and the divide is arbitrary, but it's helpful in that it speaks to very different types of strategy and very different roles for local government. So the argument goes something like this: that a clear multi-institutional strategy for raising productivity would alleviate many of the problems around slow national growth and help to narrow the regional gap in output. and that material improvements to people's high streets, community hubs, and other public spaces can be achieved much faster through the dispersal of small, patient finance to the hyperlocal level. A local government has a policy delivery role in both places, as a coordinator in the former and as a conduit in the latter. And I'm just going to take a couple of examples, one from each of those kind of things. So when we're talking about raising productivity, you know, we are in crude terms talking about getting more output for less input. And in a developed economy like ours, there are very credible studies that attribute as much as 95% of all productivity growth since the 1970s to investments in R&D and ICT. And this is something that is probably best directed nationally, given the vast sums and holistic picture required to get the things done. But as Ben referenced, there are clear roles for LEPs, councils, and combined authorities or areas of devolution deals in helping to direct investment and simulate private sector investment in R&D and ICT. The kind of areas that places with devolution deals tend to cover include a few universities, different industrial clusters, potential industrial clusters. So it's a good spatial scale for thinking about R&D, but the role of local government is ultimately a top-down coordinating role. When we think about the other side of the coin, the issue of, as is often said in the documentation, making places that people are proud to live in, feels like a much more short-term goal based on delivering quicker material benefits. And the primary driver for this is generally accepted as being the majority delivered in 2019. So, you know, in our analysis, we argue that this could be achieved more effectively and more efficiently than through the current multiple rounds of this beauty pageant style funding. This could be done through devolution of what is relatively small scale patient finance to hyperlocal groups such as parish councils, resident associations to spend on local priorities. And I would point to the Local Trust Big Local program as an example of success within such policy. And the importance of this angle has been brought into light by the pandemic, particularly around the need for local public hub spaces. As we spoke about in a previous report, renewing neighbourhood democracy, strong social infrastructure is a huge form of shared resilience in a time of crisis. So if we are going to level up, sharing up those kind of assets is really important. And local government here can be a conduit for funds. You know, also in the pandemic, local government proved incredibly adept at getting resources out to the population through things like the business support scheme. Many councils are or are developing community strategies and policies around community hubs, expanding that interface between local authority and the more hyper-local actors. So councils can work to further refine this role as a conduit for central government action into the hyper-local through doubling down on things like asset transfer, as has been the case in Wigan. So when you start to disentangle the agenda from itself, you can see two clear roles for local authorities as kind of a conduit for resource to communities and as a coordinator for productivity raising policy interventions, things like your free ports and your major infrastructure projects. And obviously these are broad categories. As I said, it's something of an arbitrary divide. The quality of the local environment from the high street to the park, the availability and affordability of housing is essential to well-being. Well-being has a well-defined positive relationship with productivity. The livability of a place, its desirability of the destination has an impact on business decisions. So they're not unconnected or entirely distinct, but our view at Localis is that if you take these things in turn and focus on the different types of policy and local government's role in implementing them, that's the best way forward for a positive conversation about localism in the context of what we've already had a question about, what is a fairly centralizing agenda. And I think I'll stop there. Thanks, John.
Many thanks indeed, Joe. Next up, Tony, if I could ask you to unmute and take it away, please.
Hi, well, good morning all. Great to take part in this event, very much of the moment. As we Jonathan mentioned at the beginning, when we were just preparing and just before we went on air, you know, we were talking about the fact that this is a policy with relatively few opponents who could be against the idea of levelling up, and I'm certainly not. But I think the challenge is what in the end does it mean, and how can this policy as implemented, you know, make good, and it is making good, 50 or 60 years of economic change, which is, and it's trying to do this in a very, very short period. It's trying to do it really, you know, within the life of a parliament. It won't be like that, but that's the implication that's given. So what would I say? Well, the first thing is that one of the challenges, I think, is that much of the debate has hitherto been about regions, and there's a lot to be said for regions, but it's not everything. There are many people with low incomes and not much opportunity in what are otherwise rich regions. and lots of very affluent people who have much higher standard of living in many cases in lower income regions. So we need to kind of make this a policy that's not just about places, though it may be about places, but it's also about people and households. The other thing I think is that the way, given the, and Ben mentioned this, given the centralised nature of British politics, and certainly the UK government in England, a lot of this comes down to areas competing for resources. And the danger there is England becomes a series of warring areas. And indeed, if you look at the arguments in Scotland and Northern Ireland, particularly in Scotland, about potential independence, there's a risk that all of this disunites the United Kingdom just by creating a competitive, we want this out of Whitehall. And if it's too much like that, it will not be helpful in protecting and preserving the Union. That's another thing. The little pots of cash issue can't be ignored. At the moment, it is, the substantial amounts of cash in small pots, and Ben mentioned this and Nottinghamshire's success in winning them. But it has to be about more than little pots of cash. You only have to ask yourself, could pots of cash really be enough to overcome a massive change in retail and the implication that has for hundreds and hundreds of high streets, not just a small number of towns. There are thousands of towns and villages in Britain. You go anywhere in the country and you'll see they all need attention. And the truth is, government isn't powerful enough to rekindle every single one. Retail is changing and we need to think about that. Joe mentioned devolution. I mean, the truth is, this is all a very centralized process, just a measure of how, how we've got here. I was just looking up, doing a piece of research, things I'm just double checking on this. If you look at the GDP per head of the East Midlands, it is substantively lower than that of Scotland, 15% lower. Scotland's public spending is 30% higher than the East Midlands. Now, different geographies I get, but simultaneously, this has been delivered by the UK government successively, not just this one, previous ones, through acts of policy. And imagine trying to level up to Scotland, and that's a lot of extra public spending for the East Midlands, the West Midlands, and several other regions, indeed London, in fact, if you're going to look at levelling up in that broader way. So, in a sense, we've got to be conscious about how much can realistically be achieved here, given how great the disparities we've had, and without proper devolution, by the way, chances that this money will be effectively used at the subnational level are very limited. And I think that's something pretty well everybody can agree on. And then not last, but well, sort of not last, but definitely not least, most important in many ways, and that is that the underlying challenge for the UK, for all parts of the UK, and for people who have not done well out of the economy, is without doubt the giving additional resources, but more to the point, esteem to post-school non-university education. That FE, further education, successive governments back into the mists of time have said this is an important issue. And yet, lo and behold, here we are with FE having not been funded as well in the last 10 or 12 years as universities. And now another government deciding this is the place to operate. And I'm sure they mean it. But the truth is, unless and until we really think about giving the same level of esteem to people who are going into through FE into new jobs that are going to come along, and also through universities and working, FE and universities working together, chances are this policy will not level up, because it is skills. If people throughout the United Kingdom had the same skill levels as towns in Surrey, companies from all over the world will be investing in them fast. And that is the thing we need to do to ensure that throughout the United Kingdom, companies from all over the world feel they want to invest here, and that all the rules that go alongside that make it as easy as possible. So that's what I would say is levelling up has to, if it does nothing else, is devolve powers and separately ensure that the skills that everybody has access to are good enough to attract footloose capital and footloose companies. Over and out.
Many thanks, Tony. comments are liking you, making sense as usual being one of them. Thank you, and thanks for raising skills. Catherine, like me, at the bottom of the alphabetical order, but gives you all time to prepare and to shine.
Indeed.
Over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a real pleasure to follow Tony, who's been a friend of local government and local communities for longer than I care to remember. Like Tony, I won't go into the overall structures because I personally believe we should have an elected upper chamber with regional representation, which would at least give people a voice in the second chamber in Parliament, and that was genuinely reflective of the regions. The second thing I wanted to do was just to highlight some good best practice of devolution. As the Vice Chair of the APPG for devolution, we have the policing police commissioners, and I feel that at least in one policy area we have actually achieved something there. They were a little bit rocky to start with, but I think they've got off to quite a good kind of balance now. And I think that is something which we've asked for a long time, to have the local determination of policing priorities. So I really welcome that. I think on transport, we still have a long way to go. And Ben, in his introduction, mentioned HS2. You see, there's virtually no local input into HS2, and it's masses of money. And I think we need to do more specifically on that theme, seeing it's being talked about. Its profile has risen in the last month. So I think why not quickly jump in and see what we can get for local areas out of that. I also think that we're probably not doing quite enough on other infrastructure in terms of the role for local priorities. And, you know, the housing agenda, for example, it's starting to look a little bit like a one model fits all areas. And we all know that if you're clever with the politics, you can get your new homes and you can get your happy residents, but you do have to be very careful about where you put those homes, how you do the consultation and so on. And I would encourage more discussion between central and local government at that level. I also think the same on the green agenda and trying to get more green jobs and more sort of climate friendly housing. That also probably should be done on a local level with a series of options as to within the building industry sector that you've got in your local area, how you can get the better, whether it's biomass, whether it's the heat pumps, whatever it is, so that in a way we're having specialisms within regions. I think that would be a real positive in terms of infrastructure. And finally, on the most important point, which once again Tony introduced, was the role of further education. You know, it has had a 50% cut since 2010. That's not to say every single penny of FE money in 2010 was being spent in a really fantastic way, but then I don't think Ben and I would agree that not every penny of public spending in other areas is being spent really well either. So I think a better marry up between FE, local authorities, the apprenticeship levy, and really trying to get that right. I don't see any reason why FE cannot be devolved entirely either to regional or large councils, because you can have really good, you know, business engagement and, you know, bring together the apprenticeship levy, which I think businesses have patiently been paying for. And I don't hear their voices saying, what am I getting back for my money? They might do when they have the minister's ear, but I don't hear them writing articles and things in the paper. And I personally think that we could be squeezing much more out of that rather than an endless discussion about corporation tax, for example. Let's talk about what we're doing with the apprenticeship levy to make the case for the role of business and what they're actually giving back to society. And we have got some examples of best practice on apprenticeship, but I would be very surprised if that levy was all being spent. And I'd be very surprised if either FE or local government had a real say in how that money is being spent. And that's a pot that's just waiting to be directed to local government, to regional government, to our mayors and council leaders, because when you're in a room full of mayors and council leaders, there's actually not much party politics in it, in my view. Most mayors and leaders want the same thing, which is best use of the pound locally. And also one thing that I'd like to challenge the sector on, because I think, you know, a good webinar always challenges back as well, is just to challenge Ben and any other local government leaders who are on the call. Is every single penny of procurement through their own local authority promoting a local living wage so that the poorest are on a decent living wage to get more people out of poverty. Number two, are the major companies which benefit from local government procurement actually employing local people, or are they bringing in people from other regions? And number three, how many apprentices per £1 million? When I was council leader and I was asked to sign off, 2 million for housing estate X because they needed a new roof, I said, well, for every million, I want to meet the apprentice. Bring the apprentice in a month after that signed off, and I want to meet him or her. And of course, they all went quiet then because the senior people never really got into the weeds of who was the apprentice or anything like that. So I have a bit more of a challenge back to local government in that we could be squeezing the public procurement much more. Rachel Reeves touched on it in a kind of a maxi element. I want to see what we're doing at micro level to really promote what we talk about and what we ask government for through local government. Thank you, Chair.
Many thanks indeed, Catherine, and many thanks to all our panelists. So we're going through straight to Q&A now. I've got a number of questions in there. But I'll go back to that though. You raised a challenge, Catherine, about use of procurement, social value, and making sure the local state's able to get the most from what it's doing. Now, clearly, there's a bigger game afoot. We've got the Green Paper on public procurement reform. We always talk about public procurement in nice big round figures, £290 billion on goods and services and all the rest of it. Just to throw us open to Ben first. No, as a local leader here, would you like to use your leadership of Nottinghamshire to promote what you can do as a convening power with businesses to promote skills, growth, and all the rest of it, without under your own steam, without too much need for central intervention?
Thanks, Jonathan. I think there's all sorts we can do, and certainly in the first weeks since I've taken over here, that we'll be trying to do that. We've got various structures already that exist that allow us to probably work more closely with our partners, whether that's universities or our district councils or whatever than we already do. There are all sorts of projects. You talk about getting best value for some of that money, whether that's local or national money. Clearly making decisions about major infrastructure spending in very, very localized silos as opposed to on a wider kind of priority planning level is probably going to be ineffective from that point of view. If we've got 130 million across North Notts, for example, and all those decisions have been taken on a town centre by town centre basis, instead of planning out what it is for our county and our area that we actually need in the round, that's not going to be as effective as if we work together on those plans. So one of the first things that I've done is try to pull together all those local leaders to talk about what services can we deliver better together, what buildings can we share, how can we improve our procurement, how can we have a more joined up planning system on a regional level. We can never agree on local government reform in terms of structures, but we can certainly work together more effectively. So trying to reach out to those partners, I think, is a really key part of that. And we've touched on a lot. I think devolution is a key part of that as well. Various panelists have mentioned the ability to devolve skills or transport planning or whatever to a local level. That's hugely important because, as has been mentioned in the chat, the skills that are needed in London or in the East Midlands might be different to the skills that are needed in the Northwest, for example. And we need to be able to decide that. You can't level up on a one-size-fits-all basis, because if that was the case and that worked, you wouldn't need to level up, would you? So the fact that the East Midlands, I think, is one of the lowest in terms of all of that investment nationally, is also one of the places that doesn't have that regional ability to choose and to prioritise in terms of some of those discussions, is probably actually fundamental to our ability to deliver on this agenda.
Many thanks, Ben. Put it to other panelists. Now, I always remember sort of Phil Collins, as in Tony Blair's former speechwriter, not the other one, would often say, look, if Tony Blair wanted to declare war, the best opportunity to do so would be at a sort of doing a conference launching a new skills program, because it's all skills is always seen as more than Cinderella. It never gets that level of national interest or uptick. Given what we know we're faced with now in terms of having to build back better, recovery, green jobs, and all the rest of it, with a huge shift in labour market patterns, how constrained is the ability to achieve short-term ambitions on FE but by the current assessment we have, either for budgets for skills or devolutionary powers to do more? Any thoughts about how we might do better? Tony, you're in first.
Oh, I mean, the reason I said there needs to be a sort of cultural shift here is that, to put it rather brutally, many people making policy and decisions about public spending, this is not their world, and it never is their world. And so there has to be, that's why I do think devolving to Ben and other subnational leaders, I use this clunky term subnational to embrace all the different things that it can be. It can be counties, city regions, Wales, but you know, I think it's more likely that these decisions will be made by people who understand. I mean, everywhere you go in Britain, there are technical colleges, usually red brick buildings or grey brick buildings, and they were an expression of the way the local education system, sometimes with support from businesses, when Britain was, you know, growing to be an industrial power, how locally there were different ways of training people in different ways. We now have such a nationalised system that, you know, with the best will in the world, and I do think ministers and civil servants do these things with the best will in the world. They're not trying to do anything other than good. But the chances of them knowing precisely what is needed in Cumbria and Cornwall, and let's keep the alliteration up here, you know, Camden, are limited. It's just not going to work as well. And I do think that therefore, there's two things, therefore. One is changing our cultural approach to post-school education, to see it as a much more seamless process involving all the agencies and business indeed, and universities as well as FE in it. But, you know, it has to be seen as equivalent. It's got to be seen as equivalent.
Many thanks, Tony. Throw over to Joe. In your look at the plan for growth, you made several points about skills. Now, labour market's been a great interest of yours. How would you see reformed skills at local level panning out?
Well, I think there's two things. There's kind of institutional arrangement, and then there's the actual way we teach and what we teach. And I think in terms of the institutional arrangement, the LGA's work local model is really good, which they developed with the Learning and Work Institute a couple of years ago, for how you could better bring together further education, local government and skills providers. So I'd recommend looking at that if anyone wanted to look at kind of, okay, how would that work? But then there's also the case of what we teach and kind of how we, and this touched on what Tony was just saying, you know, we did some work for Nottinghamshire County Council. We're talking to firms there that are doing sort of green construction, a very small level, could use help scaling up and that kind of thing. And the idea that that's going to be well targeted, that you're going to be able to pick that out from Westminster is, yeah, like I say, it's just fanciful. And furthermore, there's the Brexit thing and how that plays into it, and how a lot of our construction skills, a lot of our workforce there is retiring, getting older. So there's a real need to really improve the quality of our apprenticeships themselves. So there's kind of we've got multiple skills challenges going on at the same time. But for the local devolution, I think the first thing is look at the LJ model, look at the way they developed a model for collaboration, and try to lobby the government down those lines. If you get this down to us, these adult education budgets, etc., we can put this kind of collaboration together. We can get skills that are right locally and will help boost our productivity up. So that's a quick answer.
Many thanks, Joe. Good question from Jack Shaw. Clearly, we talking about infrastructure. You know, Catherine made the big point about HS2, how much local discretion is there over how that's being procured or as either ends. We've also got, looking through the other end of the telescope, the role of social infrastructure, things like community centres, libraries, green spaces, and all the rest of it. Jack, any thoughts about from colleagues about how that could complement kind of some of the bigger economic outcomes we're looking for? Catherine, over to you, please.
when you say social infrastructure, it's quite a big definition, but one point that I was keen to make, because sometimes in these conversations we end up talking about, you know, the infrastructure very much a sort of a capital spend. I also wanted to sort of mention the fact that your average local authority spends $500 million or whatever it is on social care. And when we're talking about green jobs and sustainability, I wanted to throw in that I think we could be squeezing that pound a little bit harder as well, not just with existing arrangements in terms of whether these are sustainable roles for the people doing them around the living wage and, you know, proper career plans, proper training pathways for staff, help with caring responsibilities and all the rest of it. But also thinking through the Health and Social Care Bill, which is likely to come to the Commons, and what impact that might have. Obviously, we're all disappointed that the industrial strategy was sort of canned, but I wonder if there's a bit more planning that we could help the government with in the area of social care and social infrastructure, where we propose some solutions that could be debated as part of the Health and Social Care Bill that looked at some of those revenue budgets in order to improve them, get better value, but also make those jobs, I guess, more worthwhile as well, and jobs that people want to stay in. So I'm sure that the Local Government Association is going to prepare something for the Health and Social Care Bill, but anything that you could brief members on as well, that we could speak about in debates and things, I think it's a really good opportunity to try and talk about sustainability in its widest term around the workforce, around the social care, and around that large quantum of spending which local government does on an annual basis.
Many thanks, Catherine. Tony, please.
For most people, you know, whenever I'm asked, you know, by particularly sort of journalists from overseas, why do local elections matter? And the simple way and it's not unique to the UK, this, but you know, the truth is that for most people, almost all the government they ever witness in real time is local government. It's what they see outside the front door every morning, and and in some senses that's precisely why they're more willing to shout at councillors and be a bit sort of difficult, because they get access to councillors, and with the best will in the world, and MPs are brilliant, two of them here, you know, you just can't, when you've got 120 or 140,000 constituents, you can't see as many of them as often as a councillor can see, and it's just a mathematical reality. But I do think that, and I never want to say more money is the answer to anything, because it can be, but it isn't always. But if you look at the local government services and spending on them in the last, you know, let's not choose a political date, 15 years, on many services, it's way lower than it was 15 years ago. And many of those are the precise services that people see outside their front door, how often the streets are cleaned, whether the potholes are filled in, all of this stuff. And it does matter to people. So I do think, you know, that it would be good for people's feeling about their areas in the way that having a decent high street is, if there was a slight tilt back towards more money for environmental services, more money for planning, more money just to make places feel as if councils have got the money to look after them. And I try not to say more money is the answer, but I think for this, they're just a bit stretched, these services. Ben, am I wrong?
No, I don't think you are. I think the challenge and the constant balance in all of this is an interesting one, because on the one hand, I would like, and we would all like, more funding and more powers on a more local level to try and sort some of that stuff, to try and focus on which of those very localized services are the ones that matter most to me and my constituents, and everything that they see outside their doorstep. And for the record, 90% of what comes across an MP's desk is potholes and town centres and things as well that are very much local decisions. But the battle and the problem that we always have, I think, from a government perspective is accountability for that. Because at the end of the day, although people are more connected to their local councils, I think they still ultimately blame government when things go wrong, even for local council decisions. So it's quite difficult to find that correct balance, I think, between wanting to have that localism and wanting to have those powers delivered as close to people as possible, and I would like to see that, but then also making very clear to people where the buck stops for that. Because what you will find, therefore, and we'll find, you know, a lot of I hope there are no representatives from my local district council on the call, but if you look historically at people's ability to bid for funding, to write proper bids, to utilise that funding, you might find that some of the councils in areas like mine haven't been very good at that, frankly, over the last few years, where money's gone into that system and you've not seen outcomes from it. £2 million for shopfront regeneration that seems to have disappeared and nobody knows how it's been used. If you're going to pass that funding down for those very local deliveries, then it needs to be clear that it is local decisions and local implementation, because you'll find some will be very good, some will be very poor, and there will be inequality, therefore. So it's hard to deliver something consistent on a very local basis. But I think that's the key to whether the things like the towns funds and everything work. A lot of those are built around town centres, high streets. I think that the town centre is the most visible sign to people of how your area is doing, right? If the town centre is in decline, you feel like your area is in decline, and vice versa. How effective those funds are ultimately are down to local government, district councils largely, and in my area, to deliver on. Some will be good and some will be awful, and that's a difficult thing to get over. That's why I think ultimately we need that regional structure that perhaps is a little bit more expert, a little bit more professional in delivery, rather than these having decisions like that over spending 130 million quid done by a very small district council. I think it needs more planning and more coherence than that.
Many thanks, Ben. Joe, can I ask you to come, and you've done a fair bit on sort of social infrastructure in recent reports. How do you see this parlaying or translating from social to economic productivity and greater well-being in place?
Well, there's someone just made a good point in the chat that it kind of becomes about future-proofing and resilience. The pandemic, I mean, if we learn anything, when it really kicked off in early March last year, it was hyper-local people's action. And what in our report, Renewing Neighbourhood Democracy, we collated a lot of different work that was done on what exactly happened there. And if defining social infrastructure broadly as like the commons, shared spaces, places that everyone can access, places without them did much, much worse on many metrics throughout the pandemic, because their preparedness was less. So it's about the way you value social infrastructure and the way you understand that its value is not just, let's say you're here in London and you've got where I am and you've got like a space as a community centre. You can get more money for that space if it's something else, but it will have a much, much smaller value to national resilience and to the area's resilience. So you need to look at it in that way as proper infrastructure in order to protect it. And in terms of economically, I think it comes down to, again, that point of livability and of, the need for play. Now that we're seeing a trend away from your out of town offices, you're out of your big sort of complexes and moving back into areas, it becomes about how well an area can sort of provide for society, social infrastructure, what props it up. So I think looking at the high street as social infrastructure, but looking at parks as well, it becomes about a place's offer, I guess, when we talk about things like investment. So I think there's a huge role for it in people's industrial strategies, or rather in their strategies for growth, to look at how you're going to center your social infrastructure and how you're going to use that to make your place desirable for investment, but also on a more broad national resilience level.
Many thanks, Joe. What other questions do we have here? Got a few asking about, obviously, Tony in his point, they raised the point, I think Robert Colville put it well yesterday in the Times. If there's a national blanket, how do you make sure that each corner is getting its fair share? Clearly, Ben raised the point given that the very asymmetric nature of devolution, large parts of non-metropolitan England don't have strategic deals to maybe channel money and resources as best they can. Is that what, with a view to two things? Firstly, that the Levelling Up white paper, what Neil O'Brien's doing in reporting to there, and secondly to the spending review coming out in the autumn. Final round of questions for each of the panelists. How would what might be necessary in order to make Levelling Up a truly balanced and equitable allocation of resources and opportunities across the country? Now, clearly, we've got some of this, at least that in the budget, we had a sort of dictionary definition of what levelling up is to support those parts of the country we previously identified Localis as being stuck, those being hit with more structural economic problems. But clearly, there'll be there'll be question in there, though, what about the Southwest? Some other parts of the country might feel neglected. What would you see as being ideal from either both levelling up white paper and a even if it's a shorter term multi-year finance settlement to at least get things ready in alignment? Ben, your hands up first.
Yeah, I think that there are two things here for me. We've touched on both of them. The first is you mentioned that some places have these devolved abilities and powers and funding, and others don't. A lot of those that don't are, to coin a phrase, red wall kind of left behind towns, working class areas outside of urban conurbations, right? And there is both an economic and a cultural and values kind of divide that we see in all sorts of conversations around the country about people feeling left behind. A lot of those places are the ones, like my own constituency, that don't have that ability to deliver on a local level. So I think fundamental to getting this right for everywhere is finding a structure that gives everybody that equal opportunity to decide those things on a local level. So effectively, what does devolution look like outside of metropolitan centres? That's key, I think, to this conversation. And there are some examples of how that's happened in other places. Some have gone better than others in terms of how it's been delivered. So that's absolutely fundamental. And I think the other point is picking up on what Tony said. I wasn't disagreeing at all when he said that funding needs to go into those localised services in terms of delivery. Look at the areas of most disadvantage and the need that is there for basic public services. Whether that's health services, whether that is skills and training that needs to be delivered in a system that's had money sucked out of it for a long time. I think that absolutely needs to be the case. A long-term system of delivery of those services that probably means more sustainable funding through whatever structure that is that covers those areas. Because what we can't continue to do is go year on year, here's £1 million or £1 billion for this and that and the other. We see it in social care, we see it in all sorts of other things. You can't create sustainable long-term services that people can build a relationship with and can work with to improve things over the long term if you're living year to year, hand to mouth in terms of funding. So I think they're the two fundamental challenges for me.
Many thanks, Ben. Anyone else like to come in? Catherine, and then Joe.
I would come in strongly on the skills side of things because I think there is some evidence, and of course the furlough situation is a bit confusing for all of us to try and match what will happen at the end of September with what's happening in our regions. But I think we need some technical thinking in all of our regions really about what's happening with the labour market and how we bring up the existing young people or older people who haven't had the skills when they were younger so that we can try and match the skills gap. Now, it's never going to be perfect because one can't predict what the economy is going to do. But given that the industrial strategy is not happening, is there a role there for local government to step in and do sort of a broad outline of what would be good for the regions that brings back some of that funding into the FE arena, but that has some strings attached which link that in with local government and with any chambers of commerce or any groupings of employers in different regions? Because I think we have a problem, which is we currently have more sort of jobs than people, how it looks a little bit in some regions. And then we have another problem, which is we don't have people who have got the numeracy, literacy and some of those basics that you need to fill some of those gaps. So I think it's urgent. And in a way, starting with the urgent things with a spending review is quite good because it can get a minister's attention. And then I think we're looking at some of those more long-term requests, which is more structural, which Ben has said. But personally, I would be going for the skills side of things. And I would scare ministers by saying, wages are going to go through the roof unless you do something about this, and try and get them to worry. Try and get them worried about something. The other one is on the health piece, which Ben also mentioned. I would just start talking about mental health. I mean, we know that it's an issue, and yet we know that there has been you know, a good 20% reduction. I think today's Guardian said it's a 20% reduction in beds, just immediately asking for those two things, because with the best will in the world, the Health and Social Care Bill is going to take a long time to get through both houses of Parliament, and that doesn't match the timing for the spending review. So I think if you just chose those two things and got local government to do some really technical in detail work about those two things, we could end up with quite a good result.
Many thanks, Catherine. There never is a good time for a fundamental restructure our health services, is there? Tony?
Well, I mean, just two or three things really as we come towards the end. I mean, the first thing is, and you know, we've got two MPs here, Catherine and Ben, and they quite rightly represent, you know, they're not this morning, they're being very non-political and non-area this morning, but generally MPs are supposed to represent the places they're elected for as our councillors, and that's a good element of our democracy. The fact is that people have a voice and that they can go and see an MP or go and see a councillor and have their local identity or whatever represented is a good thing. However, there's a downside to it as well, and that is in a very centralised system of the kind we have in the UK, certainly for England within the UK, though it's similar in Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, is that it kind of creates the sense that there's always a zero-sum game here. So there's just this many jobs in the economy, this much GDP, this much of everything, and unless we have some more of it, that means they have less of it. Well, it's not like that. During Britain's huge industrial success in the 19th century, I mean, aiming off of the environment, everywhere got richer and more or less, I mean, not rural areas as people moved off the land, but, you know, generally it was possible for major cities in the north of England, Scotland and Wales, and in the southeast, London, to do well at the same time. So it is possible to have, with enough policy and the right policy, where everybody, and the very words levelling up, after all, are levelling up. And, you know, the last thing we want to do is ever risk levelling down, which would be a very, very bad thing indeed. So, you know, so it can be everybody's area can benefit at the same time. And of course, centralisation, as I say, makes it harder to see it like that, because there's a slight sense we're just divvying up what we've got when we should be looking to make everybody better off. On a more mundane basis, local government definitely needs a 3 or 4 year financial settlement. We can't go on with 1 year settlements. They're very, very bad for rationality. And then last but not least, and I think this is, you know, I don't want to sound in any way telling political parties what to do, but I do think for the major political parties, having a sense of what all of this would lead to and what Britain would look like at the end of all of it in 10 or 15 years ago, because there isn't much of a difference between major parties on all of this. They, you know, the last Labour government started off with regional development agencies whose policy was explicitly to raise GDP up to the level of the southeast. So it's not as if there's a disagreement on most of this. I think the question is, what would Britain look like, and can it be described 10 or 15 years out from now? And I think it could be, and that would make it easier for us all to sign up to it and know what we were actually signing up for. Perhaps Localis can work on that too.
Bring back the vision thing, who knows? Joe, if I can ask you to finally close us off on this.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, yeah, no, I'll just be double quick. I think just what Jack Shaw made a good point in the chat, and it picks up on what Ben said as well about, can you do this without reorganisation? And I think, and the steer we get as a Localis when we talk to people in Whitehall is very much that no one wants to talk about reorganisation anymore, don't talk about it. But I do think there is, without some kind of equal sub-regional layer, it doesn't have to be all combined authorities, but there has to be a sub-regional layer to get money to. If you want to, we're never going to have a federal UK. But if you want to move to like a decentralised unitary state like a Holland, you have to have some kind of layer to which you can devolve to that is somehow equal. And I think that's what we're really missing at the moment. The combined authorities provide it, but there is no equivalent for non-metropolitan England. So I think that would be my final thought.
Many thanks, Joe, for that plea for non-metropolitan England. Well, we've reached the end. I'm going to blow the whistle. Huge thanks to our excellent panel today: Ben Bradley MP, Professor Tony Travers, Catherine West MP, and our own Joe Fyans. We will be issuing a recording for them who attended today, so you can catch up on YouTube or share with colleagues. Thank you so much for elements of marshmallow to the debate, Tony. But I thought, some very good points were raised, bruited around, and we'll look forward to continuing the debate with you over the course of the year. So on that basis, thank you everyone, for our panelists again. Thank you for everyone who registered to attend today. We look forward to keeping up and catching up with you soon. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks, Jonathan. Nice to see you.
Thanks, Ben. Bye, Catherine.